passage from Labor's Untold story, because this is, I wish everyone could learn about this, right? I really wish people could learn this important history, because this is the Marxist understanding of how change happens. This is from chapter 9 of Labor's Untold story. It's about the Great Depression and how people learned to struggle and fight back. The Depression was like some natural physical catastrophe, a flood, a tornado, or a hurricane, bringing monumental hardship in its wake. It was understood as little by the average man as if it had been some arbitrary disaster of nature. But unlike a hurricane, it did not blow itself out. It continued year after year, 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, getting worse and worse, stronger and stronger, stripping millions of jobs and shelter, forcing millions to the homeless road, spreading to Latin America and Europe, enveloping nations and continents, proud empires of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, the Balkans, and all of Africa and Asia. World production fell by 42%, while world trade decreased by 65%. There were some 50 million unemployed in all parts of the world. But the Red Cross did not come after the Depression struck. There was no rallying forces or coming together to care for the sick and hungry, although their number, increasing daily, was far greater than those injured or made homeless by a tornado or earthquake. At first, each man was alone, often sitting silently in his home, hiding his unemployment and growing poverty as if it were a shameful disease. Unlike a hurricane, the ravages of the Depression could not be seen clearly in a well-defined path of destruction. Instead, it was everywhere, and for a long time, things looked almost as usual. But behind the cold, expressionless fronts of tenement houses and apartments, inside and concealed from the public gaze, men and women struggled alone at first, viewing their plight as a personal, private disaster, a slow, dreadful panic rising within them. Such was the position of Peter Grossup. And the footnote here says this is an actual case history based on an interview. For obvious reasons, the exact name and location is not indicated. But such was the position of Peter Grossup, a tall, slim man of 55 with a white, cliff-like face and a habit of comfortable silence, a skilled cabinet maker. He had worked for 26 years for the Conti Custom Furniture Company in a Midwestern city of 300,000 people, until he was laid off on January 1st, 1930. He had always regarded himself and his life with quiet satisfaction. He liked what was his. He liked his house, on which he owed $1,800 on the first mortgage. He liked his wife and his 2 children. Mary, 17, attended the Sacred Heart Academy, and George, 19, was about to complete his first year at the university, the State University. Those times after supper in the easy chair were the times he liked the best. He never said much, but he'd rattle the Daily Record open and read and half listen to the radio. He liked Cameron, fellow on the Ford Hour. A lot of sense. A man got what he earned. You got no more out of life than you put into it. After such a thought, he'd sneak a look at Fanny in the kitchen, usually wearing her old gray sweater, and sometimes when the dishes were done, she'd sit for a time beside him on the little leather seat that went with his chair. Occasionally, he would fumble for her work-roughened fingers and turn them around so that he could see the plain band, the wedding ring he had given her 21 years before. He liked that ring. That was the way evenings had been before he had been fired on January 1st, 1930. 18 months later, in the summer of 1931, they weren't much like that. Mr. Grossup sat in his easy chair, but he sat there all day now, turning things over in his mind, trying to see where he made his mistake. Maybe if he had gone into electrical engineering, something with a future, things would not have gone this way. It hadn't been so bad at first. Sometimes he would leave the house all dressed up in his best, and he'd walk fast with his back very straight. He'd face carefully, held to the bright alertness, trying to look as if he were hurrying to an important business appointment. He always ended up in the park. Something will turn up, he had told his wife. The president has said so. He had $312 in the First National Bank when he was laid off. After that, he went and cashed an insurance policy for $5,000 and got $1,900 for it. If it hadn't been for payments on the mortgage, $58.50 a month, he would have lasted much longer. He had hated to part with his watch and was still always groping for it. It gave him an empty feeling, just like his vacant pocket when he had reached for it and it wasn't there. He'd received only $15 for it, and Fanny had received even less for her wedding ring. Trying to make a fool out of me, he asked. Pawning your own wedding ring? I suppose you'd married somebody else? Seemed like he'd fly off the handle these days, just for anything. Like when she asked him why he didn't go for a walk, and he went goddamming around that house and couldn't stay in his home without being driven out. Maybe if he'd gone into radio, things wouldn't have come out this way. Mr. Grossup sometimes thought, as he sat in his chair and stared at the opposite wall, he could hear his wife stirring in the kitchen, making small rustling noises of a mouse, as if she were afraid any louder noise might irritate him. The house was very still now. The children were gone. George had quit the state university. First he went to Chicago, and then to St. Louis, and later to Dallas, looking for work. He wished Fanny wouldn't worry so much about the boy. He wouldn't fall under any freight. The last time he heard, he was in San Diego, bumming his way to Dallas. He missed his daughter, Mary. She had married. Mr. Grossup didn't like Mary's husband. Sometimes he feared that she had gotten out of the house just to make things easier. No money, and the man of the house just sitting there doing nothing. For the last 6 months, he'd been coming home from the bank about the lapsed mortgage payments. Any day now. He didn't let himself complete the thought. The record was right, of course, when it pointed out that no one with get up and go, no one with real initiative and enterprise was on relief. Going down to the county relief office had been the worst. He'd had to stand in line with African Americans and foreigners and people ragged enough to be bums. As a taxpayer and a solid citizen, he had never believed in the dole. Sure, he was a union man, but the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, didn't believe in it either. Well, he hadn't gone there until Fanny, and he had been hungry. He had tried to explain to the social worker at the county relief that his case was different. He wasn't a bum. He had got on his feet, but she had just given him a tired smile, meant to be friendly but seemingly mocking to Mr. Grossup, before saying, "Next." It was hard for the two people to live on $12 a month. If he could just borrow some money for the mortgage. He called the bank, but they said that it was too late now. The case was in the courts. There would be a judgment any day now. His wife was standing in the kitchen door, looking at him. He pretended not to see her. "Peter," she said, "I just want to talk to you." Still, he didn't look at her. There was nothing to talk about. "Peter, we just have to do something." "Do something? Do you think I sit here because I like to?" Mr. Grossup, his mouth quivered. "Peter, you never used to talk to me that way." He glared at her, but she did not retreat, but eyed him firmly. "I've been talking to Mrs. Flattery next door. She said if you'd go down to the unemployment council on Spear Street, we wouldn't be evicted. Mr. Grossup was honestly shocked. Go down to that bunch of communists? I'd die first. Mr. Flattery's a member of it. We've got to do something. The sheriff will be here any day now. In his excitement, Mr. Grossup rose from his chair and stood grandly alone. The record says that bunch is communistic. They can take my house, he said, in a voice broke and queerly, but I am not asking no help from any communist. They came the next day. Mr. Grossup couldn't believe it. Even as they began taking down the beds, clumping through the house, moving the old sofa out into the street, he still couldn't believe it. They were robbing him, and he was alone. There was no one to help him. There was no police to call, for they were the ones who were doing it. Or at least it was the deputy sheriffs. Mr. Grossup stood in the kitchen, huddled in a corner so as to be out of the way. Her face was crumpled. Mr. Grossup, like a troubled shadow, followed the deputies in and out, grabbing at the furniture that he thought might fall or be scratched. Out on the street, he stood bewildered, surrounded by the property which had made his days, the refrigerator, the Atwater Kent pots, the pans, his wedding pictures, a framed photograph of George with his high school baseball team, the bed, the mattresses which they'd slept on, the dishes which they had eaten. A deputy was speculatively examining some of Mr. Grossup's best linens. The neighbors were standing around, but Mr. Grossup could not meet their sympathy or even know what was coming. Coming through the door, tottering in the grasp of two deputies who found it hard to grasp securely, was his easy chair. And as Mr. Grossup ran to help, one of the deputies stumbled and the chair crashed down the steps. "My God," Mr. Grossup cried, "you can't do that." He was conscious of Mr. Flattery picking up his sleeve and trying to speak to him, but his outrage was so intense that he did not answer him. The deputies were standing on the porch, now looking at a tall group of men and women who had suddenly appeared. A tall African-American man, apparently in charge, stood next to Mr. Flattery. "Good God," Mr. Grossup cried, trying to right his chair and restore the big leather cushion. "You can't treat a man's property that way." He looked up, around his face twitching. Mr. Flattery pulled at him again and said, "We're from the Unemployment Council, and we want to help you." "Well, my God," shrieked Mr. Grossup, "if you want to help, do something then." The tall black man looked briefly at the 5 deputies on the porch and at his 30 unemployed. "Move it back," he said. And in an instant, before Grossup's very eyes, all of his prized possessions, his easy chair, even the big refrigerator, the bedposts, the pictures, everything that was streaming back into his home. It was streaming back into his home. The neighbors began grabbing pots and pans and mattresses and stumbling a little and laughing wildly and calling out in excited tones, clumping up onto the porch and into the house. There was a little scuffle once on the porch with the deputies, but more and more the neighbors were helping, and they just pressed in. Mr. Grossup never knew how it had happened. It was a happy blur. He had his home again. He had his strength. He had his friends. His chair was in its place. His wife seemed suddenly to have grown younger. Police reinforcements appeared, but left, looking at the increasing size of the crowd outside. Someone was making coffee and sandwiches in the kitchen. It was like a party. Everyone was shouting and laughing, and Mr. Grossup shook hands with at least 24 men that he had never met before. The African-American leader of the Unemployment Council, Hugh Henderson, a sandwich in his hand, was making a speech on the front porch. Mr. Grossup somehow found himself making a speech too. After a life of hard work, he said, taking a man's home, it isn't right. They put my chair, everything out onto the street. I worked hard all my life. This isn't right. And there were cheers. Some of the crowd went away, but more seemed inside the house. We'll stay a while, said Mr. Henderson, to be sure the police don't come back. A great tension, an awful loneliness was slowly seeping away from Mr. Grossup's veins. He hadn't known how to be miserable. He hadn't known how miserable he had been. A man couldn't do anything by himself. He hadn't known how many people had been going through the exact same thing that he had been going through. Something had happened to him. He felt as if he had broken from the prison. No longer did he sit in his home all day. There were picket lines and other homes to protect and other places to defy the police. There was always someone else's furniture to put back in. And he wondered at the tight, little-turned man he had once been. It hadn't been much fun, but he was growing under the impact of adversity. And most of all, America was growing similarly. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story. Absolutely beautiful. From Labor's Untold Story. You know, for those of you who maybe caught it in the middle or whatever, this racist guy who works at he makes cabinets, or he works at a furniture factory. He loses his job. His son becomes homeless, and he's finally getting evicted from his home. And the communists come and they stop the police from evicting him from his home. And suddenly he gets involved. It's beautiful. This is the politics we need. This is the politics we need. Ugh. The reason it's making me emotional is because it's bringing back memories. Because when I was in Detroit in 2008, I was involved in activities like that. I can't go into detail. I don't want to incriminate myself, but I was involved in activities like that. There were times that families were being evicted from their homes, and we intervened. And, you know, there were a number of cases like that where people were being kicked out of their homes, and community activists and Black revolutionaries and church groups and communists were involved. And that is the politics we need. You know, what I just read to you, that is what made the Communist Party of the United States a strong organization. It was activities like that, and that kind of solidarity, that kind of brotherhood. You know, this guy is a racist. He says he doesn't want help from the communists. He doesn't want help from the unemployment councils. But it doesn't matter. And they're putting his stuff back in his home. And that causes him to wake up. It causes him to get involved in the struggle. It makes him realize that he's not alone. It makes him realize that racism isn't the way. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. This is the politics. You know, this is an old book. I mean, it's still in print, like I mentioned. This is called Labor's Untold Story. And it's printed by the United Electrical Workers Union. It's a great book, and it's still in print, and it's full of stories like that. That's a true story, right? I mean, it's based on an interview they did with Mr. Grossup. I mean, that is a true story. That's not a fairy tale. That actually happened in some suburban or in some Midwestern city in the 1930s. This actually happened. This cabinet maker lost his job. His son became homeless. You know, he was struggling. They're kicking him out of his home. And even though he said he wanted nothing to do with the Reds, nothing to do with the communists, don't give me help, They stepped in, and that woke him up, and he joined an interracial organization, black and white together, fighting the capitalists. This is our movement. This is our movement. This is our movement. And we got to fight for this history. We've got to fight for this history. Don't let them take it away from us. Don't let them turn it into some woke joke. Don't let them, call that what they just read, to call that class reductionism. This is our movement. This is the kind of activity that Mao and the Red Army did in China when they fought the landlords. This is the kind of thing that the Bolsheviks did in Russia before the Russian Revolution. This is the kind of thing that that the Bolivarian circles in Venezuela did. When I was in Venezuela, when I was walking through the streets of Caracas, they talked about, and I was walking through this one neighborhood that's a stronghold of communist support. They talked about how in the 90s, they were experiencing austerity in Venezuela. And this neighborhood would often lose electricity because the government, was, trying to cut on spending. And so the power would just go out in the area. And so they would light tires on fire and pile them in the middle of the streets. And they would have everyone in the neighborhood refuse to go to work until they turned the electricity back on. And they talked about how the government of Venezuela was being forced by the IMF and the World Bank to lay off government workers. And they didn't have enough sanitation workers. So the garbage stopped being collected. So the Communist Party of Venezuela, they started collecting the garbage. And they collected the garbage and then they dumped it on the highway in a rich people's neighborhood. And they poured gasoline on it and they lit it on fire. And then suddenly they had people come pick up the garbage. And it was these kind of struggles. That's the kind of movement that brought Hugo Chavez to power. Hugo Chavez was the leader of a popular front that involved community organizations like that, unemployment councils, labor unions. This is our movement. This is our movement. And, I guess the reason I keep doing these streams and the reason I'm committed to building the Center for Political Innovation is I don't want this to be taken away from us. I'm not going to give this up, right? I know it doesn't fit. I know they all think it's Nazi and Nazbol or something, but we can't give this up because the economic conditions are only going to get worse. This is what people need to understand. We are heading into the long, dark winter of capitalism. Right? The tendency to the falling rate of profits, the problem of overproduction. Under capitalism, your only value is when you sell yourself. You sell your labor power to a boss. You rent yourself out to a boss. And the more technology increases, the fewer workers they're going to need at the assembly line. And the easier to replace the workers that they have will be. And the wages of workers will go down, and the number of workers who get hired will go down. And that's the problem we're living in. We're living in a long-term capitalist crisis. That's what we're living in. It's caused by the computer revolution. It's caused by advances in technology. And there's millions of working people who don't have a place at the assembly line. And the only future that we have is we have to come together. We have to learn to work together. We have to form associations. We have to fight for our brothers and sisters. We have to get over our political divisions. This is what Jimmy Dore was talking about when he talked about, the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton and the United Front. This is what he was talking about. And these kinds of struggles where people from different backgrounds and different communities come together and see they have a common economic interest. This is how racism has been pushed back in the United States. It's been pushed back by the picket line, by the class struggle. And this is what people don't get. And this is the politics we have to fight for. This is the hill I want to die on, right? The hill of opposing American capitalism and imperialism with class struggle, anti-imperialism, working class socialism. This is the hill we need to die on. This is what I'm about. I am not in this for a woke joke. I am not in this for a woke joke. I'm not in this for feeling smart, for, feeling like I know more than other people. Like, this is what it's about, right? You know, this kind of history is what they've robbed from us, right? They have robbed this history from us. The history of class struggle. They always talk about the Trump people. They always talk about those good paying jobs. You remember that they always talk about, those good paying jobs. There used to be steel mills, that had good paying jobs. They didn't always pay workers very good in those steel mills. You know that? They didn't always pay workers very well in those steel mills. Steel mills used to pay workers about what fast food workers make now. But the steel workers went on strike and they occupied their factories. And that is why steel workers made very high wages. They talk about the auto workers, those auto workers, they made all this money. Again, they didn't used to make that money. Henry Ford wasn't paying them all that money at the beginning, but they went on strike and they occupied their factories and they fought the bosses and they built class struggle unions. They were organized by communists. Homer Martin, the leader of the United Auto Workers, was a communist. And that is how they got those decent pay. They think that, we don't need fast food jobs now. We need good paying jobs like steel workers. They used to pay steel workers shit also. The jobs of industrial workers got to be good paying jobs because of class struggle, because of resistance, because of people like Gus Hall, the steel worker from Youngstown, Ohio. In this book, Working Class USA, they talk about how in Youngstown, Ohio, the steel workers went on strike and they had a picket line and they carried guns on the picket line. They carried guns on the picket line and they went on strike and the police weren't able to break the picket line and bring the scabs in. So they got airplanes. They got airplanes and started flying the scabs over the picket lines. So the workers in Youngstown, Ohio, actually shot down airplanes. Did you know this? In Youngstown, Ohio, they were flying scabs over the picket line. And Gus Hall and other members of the Communist Party, they got guns and they went to the libraries and studied how airplanes work. And they took aim and they actually shot down airplanes. They shot down scab airplanes in Youngstown, Ohio. That is some militancy. That is some militancy, right? And other people. I mean, I talked to older communists who said they remembered when those scab airplanes were dropping scabs into the plant in parachutes, and the workers would be shooting at the parachutes, shooting holes in the parachutes. I mean, we forget. I mean, it's not that we forget. It's that we never knew how we got what we have. We assume that nobody had to fight. We assumed that we just had a minimum wage. We assumed that we just had unemployment insurance, that we assumed that we just had food stamps. These things just, no. The only reason those things exist is because people had to fight. And the reason they're getting rid of them, the reason Obama cut food stamps and got away with it, the reason that, that there has been so much economic devastation is because we've forgotten how to fight. And we've forgotten how to stand together. We've forgotten about union militancy. We've forgotten about class struggle. We've forgotten about socialism and the workers versus the bosses. We've forgotten about all of this, right? They made socialism about the status quo. They made socialism about wokeifying the country. That is not what socialism is about. Socialism is about refusing to fight in a boss's war. Socialism is about realizing that when the capitalist bosses want to attack a country like Iran or Venezuela or China or Cuba, if the capitalist bosses and their government want to attack it, that means they're our friends, they're our allies, because we'll never support the bosses. Never going to fight in a boss's war, right? Never going to stand with the bosses, the people around the world that are fighting for their national liberation against U.S. imperialism, are allies of the working class in the home country. Just like the people of Yemen are fighting off the U.S.-backed government in Saudi Arabia, we are fighting against the big banks and oil companies over here, right? Just like those people in Donbass are fighting against the U.S.-backed neo-Nazis, backed by the United States, armed by the United States. We are fighting against the big corporations and banks over here. And we don't trust their media. We don't trust their corporations. We don't think that the capitalist government is a defender of the working people, because it is not. The capitalist government of America is a defender of the billionaires and the bosses. What we want is a working class government, a government of the working class, a government of action that fights for working families. This is the politics that we need. We desperately need this kind of politics, right? This is the kind of politics that we need. And, I didn't realize I was going to get so emotional there, but I'm reading you this true story from the Great Depression. And, we need to stand up for this kind of politics. This is the politics that made communism strong. This is the politics that made socialism strong. And, I started out this live talking about Victor Hara and all of that. I mean, this is the politics. This is the hill we need to die on. This is the flag. This is the red flag we need to keep raising, and not let them tear it down, and not let them use it for something else, and not let them pretend that it's something other than it is, because this is what we've got. This is all we've got, right? This is the politics of Woody Guthrie, the politics of Henry Winston and Paul Robeson, right? This is the politics that we have. This is all we've got as working people, is that politics. It's all we've ever had. It's all we've ever had.